Real stories, real people.
Palm Bay, Florida, woke up quietly on January 28th, 2024. The streets were calm, neighbors walked their dogs, and cars moved slowly through the morning light. It seemed like just another ordinary day in a city built on routine, but at 8 o'clock, sirens shattered the silence. Patrol cars, ambulances, tactical units, chaos in a place where chaos rarely happens. The neighborhood didn't understand what was going on. The only thing that became clear was that something terrible had happened inside a family home. Hours later, police confirmed the unthinkable. Among the victims was Father Robert Hofner, a priest beloved by the entire community. Robert Hofner was no ordinary priest. For 50 years, he served the local diocese, guiding entire generations through baptisms, funerals, weddings, and reconciliations. He was a familiar face, a calm voice, a symbol of spiritual stability. Although retired, he still celebrated Mass occasionally and remained active in community service. He lived with his sister Sally, also cherished in the area. To those who knew him, Robert represented everyday kindness, the kind that doesn't need attention but is felt deeply. No one could have imagined that his life would end in the middle of such a brutal and senseless chain of events. The terror began long before reaching the priest's home. The attacker, a 4-year-old man and grandson of the person he had argued with that morning, fell into a deadly family dispute. He killed his own grandfather and then fled, armed and out of control, in what officers later described as a completely unhinged state. Police received multiple calls as he wandered erratically through the neighborhood. In that chaotic escape, he ended up at the home of Robert and Sally Hofner. And there, the tragedy escalated into a level of destruction no one could have anticipated. Investigators believe the attacker entered the house without any prior connection to the priest or his sister. He didn't know them. There was no personal motive. It was an act of random violence driven by emotional collapse after the first killing. Inside the home, he attacked Sally, then turned on Robert, inflicting fatal wounds. There was no time to call for help, no chance to defend themselves. The house that had always been a peaceful refuge suddenly became the scene of an unimaginable crime. After killing them, the attacker continued running through the streets. Witnesses saw him injured, frantic, still armed. Police located him minutes later. A brief but intense confrontation followed. Officers opened fire, and the attacker was killed at the scene. With him, the threat ended, but the devastation did not. 3 lives were lost: his grandfather, Sally Hofner, and Father Robert. And the entire neighborhood was left scarred by an episode of sudden, irrational violence that began as a family conflict and ended by destroying the lives of innocent people who had nothing to do with it. When detectives entered the Hofner home, they described a scene that was silent, heartbreaking, and deeply unsettling. There were no signs of a prolonged struggle, only a sudden explosion of unexpected violence. Robert and Sally were already gone. The rooms around them remained untouched, as if the home itself hadn't yet understood it was witnessing a tragedy. Neighbors, many of them parishioners and longtime friends, gathered outside as soon as they saw the police tape. Some cried openly, others just stared at the ground. The question echoed everywhere. Why this house? Why these people? Why this day? The news spread like lightning. Within hours, the Catholic community of Palm Bay gathered silently inside St. Joseph Church, where Robert had served as pastor for decades. The church bells rang slowly, each toll sounding like a lament. Parishioners shared stories of how he had comforted entire families, visited the sick, and remembered names and anniversaries as if they were sacred details. Many clung to the belief that Robert died the way he lived, accompanying others, even through suffering. But the reality remained painfully clear. an innocent priest and his gentle sister had been taken by a violence they never invited. At a press conference, the police chief described the entire episode as a senseless act of violence. He explained that the attacker acted alone, driven by a mixture of family conflict, emotional instability, and total loss of control. There was no religious motive and no connection to the victims. It was simply an unpredictable tragedy. His words aimed to calm the community, but they also highlighted how fragile any town can be in the face of impulsive violence. The message was clear. Danger sometimes appears without warning, without logic, without reason, and its consequences can be devastating. Father Robert's funeral filled the church to capacity. People of all ages came to say goodbye. Some held old photographs, others clutched rosaries. Many couldn't hold back tears. They spoke of his dedication, his humility, his decades of service. They also remembered Sally, kind, gentle, always present in parish activities. The farewell became a collective act of healing, an attempt to find light in the middle of darkness. But the emptiness left by both siblings was impossible to ignore. Though the tragedy marked Palm Bay forever, the legacy of Father Robert Hoffner remains deeply alive. His 5 decades of ministry left permanent imprints. Families supported, young people guided, elders comforted, friendships built. The community decided to honor him by creating a fund to help vulnerable people, exactly what he would have wanted. Inside the church, a plaque bearing his and Sally's names reminds visitors of their quiet goodness. Not to remember the violence, but to preserve their light. Because even though an irrational act ended his life, everything he built over so many years continues to guide those who knew him. Seneca, Kansas, is the kind of place where everyone knows their neighbor's name. Saints Peter and Paul Church is the heart of the town weddings, funerals, dawn prayers, quiet confessions. That's why, when the early hours of April 3rd, 2025 exploded with sirens tearing through the calm, no one understood what was happening. Group chats repeated the same message: something happened at the parish. Minutes later, the unthinkable was confirmed. The priest who had spent years guiding the entire community had been attacked, and the peace of Seneca shattered in a single night. Father Arul was born in India, but his vocation led him halfway across the world to Kansas. He had spent more than 20 years serving rural American communities. He spoke with a soft accent and carried a gentle smile that erased any cultural distance. He was known for arriving early to every Mass, walking alone through the sanctuary, whispering his prayers, and visiting parishioners to make sure no one felt forgotten. Seneca embraced him as one of their own. To many, he represented stability, calm, and a simple yet steady faith, deeply human, unmistakably sincere. April 2nd passed, like any other day. Arul celebrated Mass, visited a couple of families, ate a quiet dinner in the rectory, and reviewed parish paperwork. No one sensed any danger, no threats, no signs. According to the police reconstruction, the priest went to bed early, as always, but someone else was moving through the streets that night. A 6-year-old man from the area walked past the parish several times. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't alert anyone. He simply waited, and no one could have imagined what was about to unfold. In the early hours of April 3rd, the suspect entered the rectory area. Investigators believe Father Arul heard noises and stepped out to see what was happening. That was when the attacker, without a single word, opened fire. Shots echoed through the narrow hallway, bouncing off the wooden walls. Arul fell wounded but managed to call for help. Minutes later, an ambulance arrived. Police secured the building and arrested the suspect without resistance. The priest, gravely injured, was rushed to the local hospital. His condition was critical, but he was still conscious. At Namaha Valley Community Hospital, doctors did everything they could, but the gunshot wounds were too severe. Parishioners and fellow priests began arriving at the emergency room. Some prayed softly. Others cried, unable to understand why anyone would harm such a peaceful man. Father Arul died shortly after, surrounded by trembling hands and whispered prayers. The news hit Seneca like a blunt force. Within hours, the diocese confirmed the tragedy. A priest who had dedicated his life to the community had died violently in his own church. The shock was immeasurable. The suspect was identified as a six-year-old man with a limited record of minor disputes but no public history of violence. Police did not reveal a clear motive. It wasn't theft. There was no prior argument, no known conflict between him and the priest. Prosecutors charged him with first-degree murder, indicating intention and premeditation. Yet the lack of explanation continues to haunt the community. For many, the attack felt senseless, an unexpected strike against a man who had no enemies. The suspect's silence made the tragedy even more disturbing. As the sun rose, the news spread across the entire state. The church filled with flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. Neighbors who had never cried in public embraced one another at the rectory door. Some remembered how Arul had stood beside them during funerals, weddings, illnesses, or family struggles. Others recalled that he always had a minute to listen, even when tired. In a town where almost nothing ever happens, violence struck the most sacred place. Fear, sadness, and disbelief all settled into one collective breath. The local bishop spoke that same day. He urged people to avoid speculation, respect the police investigation, and remember Father Arul, the way he lived with serenity. Across Kansas, parishes posted photos of the priest and messages of mourning. Many emphasized the same qualities: his kindness, his quiet joy, his humble way of serving. The diocese organized a candlelight vigil around Saints Peter and Paul Church. Hundreds gathered under the cold April air. The silence was profound. It felt as if the entire town was searching for an explanation that simply didn't exist. Father Arul's funeral brought together hundreds of priests from nearby cities, neighbors, migrants he had helped, entire families. His casket, covered with a liturgical cloth, was placed before the altar where he had celebrated Mass countless times. Authorities acknowledged that violence should never enter a sacred space. As the procession moved toward the cemetery, the church bells tolled slowly. Each strike seemed to remind the town that they had lost more than a priest. They had lost a steady presence, a comfort, a quiet pillar. The wound would take a long time to heal. After the tragedy, the town made a choice: to remember Father Arul for how he lived, not how he died. A small permanent memorial was placed by the church entrance with a photo of him smiling and a plaque reading, "He served with love. He lived with humility." The investigation continues, but the community holds tight to what he represented: hope, peace, and simple goodness. Although his absence is heavy, many say they still feel him near when they enter the church. His story didn't end with the gunfire. It remains carved into the people he cared for. Father Richard "Rick" Gross had arrived in Malaga, Spain, to fulfill a dream he'd postponed for years: serving as a chaplain on a Mediterranean cruise. At 80 years old, he was still full of life. He loved the ocean, classical music, and long conversations with strangers. He had flown from Boston with genuine excitement, carrying only a small suitcase and a travel guide marked with colorful post-its. His plan was simple rest for a few days before joining the ship. But what was meant to be a peaceful adventure turned into a tragedy that would soon shake two countries. Although officially retired, Richard never stepped away from his vocation. He visited hospitals, comforted the elderly, and celebrated Mass whenever a parish needed help. He was known for his kind nature, his habit of remembering birthdays, and the way he listened without rushing anyone. His gentle humor could disarm even the most guarded hearts. When he said he would travel alone to Spain, everyone told him to be careful. He gave his usual answer, "Don't worry, God always opens the way." For those who loved him, the trip felt like a well-earned reward after decades of service. No one imagined how brutally that path would twist. Richard rented a small tourist apartment on a quiet street in the historic center, a bright, cozy place close to cafes and museums. Security footage later showed him arriving by taxi. What he didn't know was that two men were watching him from a distance. He didn't notice them. He went inside with his suitcase, probably thinking about resting before a peaceful evening walk along the waterfront. Malaga was alive, tourists, music, happiness in the air. For him, it was a breath of fresh air, the perfect beginning. But the men following him weren't looking for rest. Their intentions were. The investigation later revealed that the two men, one French, the other of North African origin, were linked to a series of violent robberies. Detectives believe they targeted Richard as an easy victim, elderly, alone, foreign, unsuspecting. They followed him from the taxi to the apartment building, keeping enough distance to avoid suspicion. They knew what they were doing. They knew how to move, how to wait, how to exploit the isolation of a tourist rental. To them, it was just another hit. To Richard, it was an invisible threat already walking behind him, and no one stepped in to stop them. That night, the two men managed to enter the building. Police believe they knocked on his door pretending to be workers or neighbors. When Richard opened, they attacked immediately. Only investigators know the exact sequence, but the report was clear. He was overpowered, beaten, and ultimately strangled. He died without a chance to call for help. The attackers searched the apartment for cash and valuables, then fled, leaving behind a chilling silence. Outside, the city remained full of lights, music, and life. No one heard anything. No one knew that inside that apartment, violence had claimed another victim. When Richard didn't respond to several messages, the people close to him grew concerned. He never took long to reply. It was the lodging staff who eventually entered the apartment after noticing something strange. Complete silence and a door left slightly open. They found his body and immediately called the police. The scene spoke for itself. Malaga, a city accustomed to welcoming travelers from around the world, was suddenly stunned. Within hours, homicide detectives took over the case. The question was as obvious as it was painful. Who would want to harm such a gentle, harmless man? Spanish police moved quickly. They reviewed cameras, taxi routes, and street movements. Footage showed the two suspects following Richard from the airport and lingering around the building. That evidence was decisive. In less than a week, both men were arrested. Stolen items and belongings taken from the apartment were found in their possession. Prosecutors linked them not only to Richard's murder but to other violent robberies as well. The case became clear. They had followed him, attacked him, and killed him deliberately. An opportunistic crime, brutal, calculated, and entirely unjustifiable. When the news reached the United States, the Boston community was devastated. Local media shared his story, showing photos of the priest smiling, celebrating Mass, walking with friends. Sadness mixed with disbelief. How could someone like him die in such a cruel way? His parish organized vigils, masses, and gatherings for support. Many described him as a man of light, a priest who never turned anyone away, a loyal friend. His death became a transatlantic wound, a U.S. priest murdered in a country he had traveled to with hope and excitement. Richard's body was flown back to the United States. His funeral gathered hundreds of parishioners, priests, and lifelong friends. He was remembered as generous, humble, always ready to listen. His casket, covered with a white cloth, was lowered as church bells echoed softly. There were no speeches of anger, no calls for revenge, only gratitude for a life devoted to service. In Malaga, the nearest parish held a mass in his honor. Even though he had never celebrated there, they wanted to say goodbye with dignity. A quiet gesture, deeply human. The murder of Father Richard Gross brought sorrow, but it also revealed a powerful truth about what it means to dedicate your life to others. The thieves took material things, but they couldn't touch what he truly left behind: kindness, wisdom, compassion. In Boston, many say they still feel him in the pews he used to sit in. In Malaga, some people leave anonymous flowers near the apartment where he died. His story traveled farther than his last cruise ever could, because even in his final moments, his life continues to inspire.